Welcome into another episode of the North Carolina Tar Heels Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Logan Lazarchik, as well as the lead beat writer for the North Carolina Tar Heels on SI, back with another episode today to provide you guys the latest news, the latest developments from Chapel Hill. As we say every day, we appreciate you guys tuning in to today's episode. You can catch today's podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or any other platforms where you get your podcasts. But without further ado, we are going to be talking about Matt Abel's decision to withdraw from the NBA draft and return to North Carolina for the 2026-27 college basketball season. Obviously, it's a huge bit of news for North Carolina Tar Heels, who were hoping that the North Carolina State transfer would indeed stay in North Carolina and not go through the NBA draft process. And after a strong scouting combine performance, it was kind of teetering on the balances of would he declare for the draft or would he stay with the program. And Matt Abel deciding to stay in college for at least one more season, playing at least one season with Michael Malone as head coach is certainly a huge lift for North Carolina, who, if Matt Abel were to leave for the draft, definitely would have hampered, their ability to compete in the ACC, especially against the likes of Duke and Louisville. So Matt Abel stays at North Carolina, doesn't leave for the draft, and North Carolina, I would say their ceiling in the ACC is most likely the third seed. And, as I said, this is obviously really good news for the Tar Heels, who, in the last several weeks really didn't know the future of Matt Abel and where it stood in Chapel Hill. But what we will be talking about today is what it means for North Carolina, what Abel's outlook in Chapel Hill will be for next season, what his role will be next season. And so we'll talk about both the few of those things. And we'll start with his performance at the NBA Scouting Combine and how that, that kind of affected his decision. And at first, when he first transferred to North Carolina, it seemed to be a foregone conclusion that he would indeed see that out. But once he was invited to the Scouting Combine in Chicago about a couple weeks ago, in which he partook in, and he blew the Scouting Combine numbers away. There were two drills in which he really stood out. In addition to the scrimmages, one of the drills was the spot up shooting drill, which he ranked amongst all prospects. He ranked 11th, connecting on 17 of 25 attempts. And in the 3-point drill, he ranked 25th among all prospects, hitting 13 of 25. And that's the area where you're going to see his impact the most at North Carolina, is his ability to operate off the ball, coming off screens, hitting shots from the perimeter, hitting mid-range shots. And I think, with Terrence Brown, Nicholas Abdallas, that's where you'll see him excel. Matt Abel, didn't really play a lot of minutes at North Carolina State. I think that's kind of why he flew under the radar during the transfer portal window. And, he definitely had interest from a lot of, blue blood programs, but he was always a name that slid under the radar and really wasn't one that was talked about a lot. And North Carolina was able to land him, keep him in state. And, he averaged 8.8 points per game, 3.4 rebounds, only played 21.9 minutes off the bench, shot 41.6% from the field, 35.5% from three-point range under Will Wade, who's now at LSU. And, Matt Abel spoke to reporters during the combine and, during private workouts, saying that he wasn't really able to showcase his skill set at North Carolina State because of the limited playing time. But once he was at the combine, he really got to showcase what he can do on the court. He developed and illustrated he could be a two-way player at the next level. And his stock rose so high that he was, a borderline first-round pick. The latest mock draft in ESPN had him as the 33rd overall pick to the Brooklyn Nets. And, there were reports that his agents were trying to get a guaranteed contract from NBA teams. But in the end, he was going to make more money playing for North Carolina for at least one season. And this is certainly, a huge lift for North Carolina. When you kind of look at their lineup, he's going to be their starting small forward. Expecting to start alongside Nicholas Abdallas, Terrence Brown, Stan Kada, Jaren Stevenson. And I expect him to average clearly double-digit points. He'll surpass at least 10 points per game. He averaged nearly 9 points in just over 21 minutes per game at North Carolina State. So I expect his role to be elevated in North Carolina. I expect him to excel in that role in a much more offensive-friendly scheme under Michael Malone, who's had success at the NBA level. And when you kind of look at what Matt Abel is going to do for this team, and when you juxtapose it to what North Carolina got from its backcourt last season, three-point shooting was certainly not an area that was a strength for North Carolina. Their best three-point shooter last season was Henry Vasar, who shot 42.6% from beyond the arc, and Derek Dixon shot 36% from three-point range last season. And other than that, they didn't really have a steady, consistent three-point shooter. Luka Bogovac, he could hit threes from time to time, but he really wasn't consistent. He was up and down. High variance player. Kyan Evans, who they brought in from Colorado State, really, didn't help out. It ended up being, a bench player after starting the season as a starter. And Seth Trimble was never known for his three-point shooting ability. So Matt Abel instantly elevates that area of the roster. Expect Terrence Brown, Nicholas Abdallah to sprinkle in three-pointers as well. But I think Matt Abel's ability to come off screens, to beat defenders to the ball, create open shots, not even having to dribble, I think that kind of opens up the rest of the floor, especially for the front court players who, Stan Keita is going to have to depend on, the guard play, other players around him to create space for him. He's not yet a creative player for himself. He's more of a typical center who operates closely to the basket. He's not one that's going to, slide out onto the perimeter and hit shots. And they're still working on bringing in Alexandros Semidorov from Greece. He's another player that could, help create space for Stan Keita. But right now at Matt Abel, in terms of off-ball wings, off-ball guards, he is going to be the player that creates those opportunities for Keita and the other front court members. And so I think Matt Abel, when you kind of look at what he's done for North Carolina State last season and during his freshman year, there were a lot of times where he, they used him off the ball a lot to catch and shoot mid-range spot shots, just like he excelled at during the combine. I expect to see similar things at North Carolina, but with more talent and better coaching. I do think Abel will take that next step in his development. And that was his entire goal when he was making this decision. His decision is revolved around becoming the best NBA player that he can be. And although he wants to be in the NBA as soon as possible, I do believe that being in North Carolina for at least one season expedites his development process. And, this draft is also, littered with elite talent, especially freshman talent. And I think next season he'd be more suited, more equipped to be a first-round pick with another strong season, less competition in the draft class. So I think all in all, this makes overall sense for both parties. I think both parties kind of need each other to, fulfill their potential, fulfill their goals. And, as I said, North Carolina, if they were not able to retain Matt Abel, they wouldn't, in terms of the ACC competition, I don't think that they would really be viewed as even a slight contender. And even with Matt Abel, they're going to have an uphill battle to overcome, Louisville, Duke, Virginia kept all their players. But right now, if you had to ask me what I believe that their ceiling is for next season in the ACC, I would probably say a third place finish is probably most likely their ceiling. I just don't see them really finishing in top two. But Matt Abel, I think offensively, you'll see his impact on the perimeter shooting. I think he's an underrated, creator off the dribble. I think you'll see glimpses of that. I think you'll see him operate at point guard, specific, rotations that they'll have. I do think for the most part, though, they'll have Terrence Brown and Nicholas Abdallah as the two primary ball handlers with Matt Abel. If he gets a rebound and gets on transition, he's more than capable of doing that. He doesn't have to depend on, guards to create shots for him. And then defensively, I think he is an underrated defender as well. He's, 6'6", 211 pounds. He demonstrated that as well as in the combine of, creating opportunities on defense, creating, offensive points from those, turnovers and transition. I expect to see that extended into the 2026 season with North Carolina. And Matt Abel, I think, is a major addition and retention for Michael Malone in his first year at North Carolina. Michael Malone, I believe, has set a really good foundation for what the Tar Heels are trying to accomplish in 2026 and beyond. And, if you look at kind of his recruiting process, he's targeting players with specific skill sets. And, during his introductory press conference, he mentioned that shooting the ball, the ability to be efficient at all three levels of scoring is something that he's looked at through, the transfer portal, through the recruitment pool. And Matt Abel definitely fits that description. So I think, again, this is a huge win for North Carolina. It was something that certainly wasn't guaranteed, especially late on the process. I mean, Matt Abel essentially waited until the last second to announce his decision to stay at North Carolina. But in the end, North Carolina will definitely take that over him, announcing his decision to stay in the draft early on in the process. So they keep Abel. This allows Maxwell Adams to stay on the bench, develop as, a potential sixth man as a freshman, allow him to, ease into his role at North Carolina. And, when you look at this roster, now that you know that Matt Abel is part of the equation, I think Michael Malone could finally kind of set what his game plan, set his rotations, give himself a better idea of what he wants to do with this roster. And now North Carolina doesn't really have to worry about making any last second, additions in, on the wing or in the backcourt. They can now focus on those rotations. What they need to strengthen now is their front court depth. You have Saint Keita, Cade Betterman. Like I said, they'll probably add Alexandros Samodurov at some point in the coming days. According to David Sisk of 24/7 Sports, it seems like an inevitable case that Samodurov will eventually sign with North Carolina at some point this offseason. They just have to work out some details in the contract. But now, North Carolina now doesn't have to worry about going back onto the market and finding a replacement for Matt Abel. The roster is essentially solidified, essentially cemented with the pieces that they have at their disposal, with, the Greek center potentially on his way to Chapel Hill as well. But like I said, I think the fact that you keep a player that also has familiarity with ACC opposition, and, now what he demonstrated through the combine is that while it did raise his draft stock and, raise the probability of him leaving North Carolina, it also was a snapshot of what he can be, with elite coaching, in my opinion, with a strong roster. And I think at this point right now, North Carolina is being a tad underrated heading this season. Like I said, I don't think they're going to be, a national title contender, but I also don't think they're going to be an 8 or 9 seed as they currently are viewed right now. So I think with this addition, with knowing what their roster is, I do think North Carolina is well equipped to surprise many people in college basketball this upcoming season. But we'll see how the rest of the offseason unfolds. We'll see what else transpires in the coming days. We've seen plenty of players around the country who were in the same process as Matt Abel also announced their decision to stay in college for at least one more season. And so I think, we'll see that trend continue today as the deadline closes. But again, Matt Abel, he went through the process, speaking with several teams, receiving feedback on what he has to do to improve his stock and, improve his chances of being drafted in the near future. But I think, again, win-win for both parties. Matt Abel, I think this is the best course of action for him. I know that he may be disappointed that he wasn't viewed higher in this year's draft, but I also think when you're considering the other players in this draft, the amount of talent in this draft, he shouldn't be ashamed of like how it played out. So he'll have next year. I think he will be a first-round pick if, he continues to show this development and what he has, accomplished during the combine. And, shooting in the NBA, if you're going to be a role player, being able to shoot and play defense are two major components. And he demonstrated both those things during the scouting combine last week in Chicago. And I think both of those, aspects of his game will be apparent at North Carolina next season. But again, the Tar Heels coaching staff, roster, fans, they should be ecstatic about Matt Abel staying in North Carolina. And I do believe that Matt Abel could be one of the top 2 best players on this roster in the 2026-27 college basketball season. But with that being said, that will do it for our episode today. Again, I appreciate you guys tuning in, and we will be here throughout the offseason with more news, developments, and updates for North Carolina Tar Heels in college basketball and in college football.